Welcome back to another episode of a random Blue Jays First Blue Jays Days. On this week's episode, Steve Grilli. Steve Grilli, a right-handed pitcher, was born May 2nd, 1949 in Brooklyn, New York. The Blue Jays acquired Steve when the Blue Jays purchased his contract from the Detroit Tigers on February 25th, 1978. Prior to his acquisition by the Blue Jays, he spent parts of 3 seasons in Detroit, going 4-3 with a .458 ERA across 145 1/3 innings. Steve started his Blue Jays career in Syracuse for the 1978 season, posting a 9-12 record with a .396 ERA. Steve spent almost all of the 1979 season in Syracuse, going 9-7 with a .201 ERA across 103 innings, striking out 65. Steve was called up to the Toronto Blue Jays prior to a doubleheader on September 17, 1979 in Toronto against Boston. At the time of his call-up, the Blue Jays were 49-99, 48.5 games back of the eventual American League champion Baltimore Orioles. The starting lineup for the Blue Jays in the second game, that started at 8:28 p.m. at Old Exhibition Stadium. Alfredo Griffin at short, Joe Cannon in right, Al Woods in left, Tony Salaiti at DH, John Mayberry at first, Rick Bossetti in center, Dave McKay at second, Tim Johnson at third, Bob Davis at catcher. Rico Cardi would later pinch hit for Joe Cannon, and Otto Velez would later hit for Bob Davis. And Pete Hernandez would run for Otto Velez. On a side note, Peter Hernandez would play in 3 games for the Blue Jays in 1979 without getting an at-bat. The starter for the Blue Jays that night was Dave Frieselban. Jerry Garvin and Tom Buski would also see action on the mound for the Blue Jays. The Red Sox roster would feature superstars Dwight Evans and Fred Lynn, along with future Hall of Famer Jim Rice. Chuck Rainey would start on the mound for the Red Sox. Steve would enter the game in the top of the third with the Blue Jays trailing 5-2, replacing starter Frieselban. With 2 out and Jim Dwyer on first, Steve would induce a ground out to the first baseman, ending the inning. Steve would remain in the game to start the 4th. After allowing a leadoff single to Butch Dobson, Steve would retire Dwight Evans, who dropped down a sacrifice bunt, strike out Mike O'Barry. This would be Steve's final big league strikeout, and then Stan Poppy would fly out, stranding that leadoff single. In the top of the 5th, Jays still trailing 5-2, Steve would retire Jack Brohammer, Fred Lynn, and Jim Rice in order on 3 flyouts. Jerry Garvin would replace Steve to start the top of the 6th. The Jays would go on to lose 5-3. The final line for Steve in his Blue Jays debut, 2 1/3 innings pitched, allowing 1 hit with 1 strikeout. Steve would not make another appearance in the MLB. An interesting side note, the first player Steve ever faced in the big leagues as a member of the Tigers was Jim Rice, striking him out, September 19th, 1975. The last player Steve ever faced in the big leagues was Jim Rice, September 17th, 1979, who he retired via a flyout. 1980, Steve would play the entire season in Syracuse. In 1981, Steve split time between Syracuse and Rochester in the Baltimore organization. While in Rochester, Steve would be part of baseball history. On April 18th, 1981, a game between the Pawtucket Red Sox and the Rochester Red Wings began, and it would become the longest game by innings ever played. The game lasted 33 innings. The losing pitcher of that game, that actually finished June 23rd, 1981, after the original game was suspended at 4 a.m., was Steve Grilli, who was not actually with Rochester when the game started 2 months earlier. A few other notable players to play in that game: Cal Ripken Jr. for Rochester, who ended the game 2 for 13, and Wade Boggs for Pawtucket, who would go 4 for 12. In retirement from baseball, Steve would go on to be a scout, as well as be a color analyst for the Syracuse AAA franchise. Steve would also open Change of Pace restaurant in Syracuse, whose website states, "Welcome to the Change of Pace, the perfect place for people who like to watch the game with a cold beer and hot wings. Stop by and watch your favorite team on our new 80-inch TV, and don't forget to order a few dozen of our award-winning chicken wings and a pizza made with our homemade dough. Like our Facebook page to check out our daily specials and be the first to know about our upcoming special events. Post Standard's Best of CNY Awards, Best Specialty Buffalo Wings. Table hopping with CNY Reader's Choice Award, Best Neighborhood Bar, Best Sports Bar. Voted Best Chicken Wings in CNY by WSTM News Channel 3 viewers. Voted Best Chicken Wings in the Syracuse New Times. If the name Grilli sounds familiar to you, Steve's son Jason would go on to pitch with the Blue Jays for 72 games in the 2016 and 2017 seasons. Thanks for listening, and in the next episode, we talk about the Blue Jays' debut of Jeff Kent.
Hello, my name's Poku and I don't know what to do.